All right, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating, grimly Gothic philosophical fable called The Alchemy of Absurdity. Our source material is essentially a dark confession from the void, and it's framed from the crumbling, decaying perspective of a figure known as the Architect of Ash. Through his eyes, we're going to explore a series of parables told by a traveling storyteller. It's a narrative that tracks this huge, tragic collapse of absolute certainty into the delightful, messy chaos of creative freedom.
To really grasp this fable, we have to start right down in our narrator's freezing, desolate reality. The Architect of Ash is basically inviting us into his ruins, saying, "Welcome to my decaying realm." See, he genuinely believed that his merciless intellect had forged this fortress of pure reason. It was supposed to be a massive monument to a god who was frantically trying to outrun his own shadow. The atmosphere here is just viscerally suffocating. You've got crumbling cathedrals, a dead, freezing void outside, and the ruler of it all is sitting on a throne made of literal cold soot. It perfectly sets the stage for a massive, inevitable fall from grace.
And that brings us to the core question of our explainer. How does a world paralyzed by absolute certainty remember how to dance? I mean, think about your own life for a second. When we get completely paralyzed by this desperate need to be absolutely right, how do we remember how to live playfully? This is the exact riddle we're going to unravel as we track a character known as the Wanderer. We're following his descent from the rigid, calcified logic of the last man all the way down into the fluid, spontaneous joy of the unscripted soul.
In the text, these rigid belief systems are called cathedrals of cardboard. Now they look imposing, right? They masquerade as these impenetrable stone fortresses of absolute truth. And we all build these. We build these rigid systems of ego to protect ourselves from the unknown. But as you'll see, when they're finally confronted by the cold, undeniable wind of the abyss, we realize they are completely dead, brittle constructs built on a fragile illusion.
This brilliantly illustrates the central Nietzschean conflict running throughout the fable. On one side, you have the iron hammer of genealogy. These are the brutal, calcified tools of order, the heavy, methodical weight of forced logic and negation. And warring against it is the medicine of the spill. This is the fluid, rushing grace of becoming. It's delightful absurdity, wild, unscripted improvisation. The whole story revolves around moving from that suffocating, heavy iron of logic into this chaotic, life-giving medicine.
Moving right along to part 1, Shattering the Paper Cathedral. Let's see how this first parable unfolds.
The story begins with the Wanderer standing in the dust of his ancestors. His knuckles are white, violently clutching his iron hammer, desperate to nail his own shadow to the frozen earth because he's convinced he possesses raw, absolute truth. But then, a sibling of chaos known as the Wit steps into the Gothic dusk. The Wit is like a distorting mirror, using language itself as a weapon to deconstruct truth. His cynical laughter rings out like falling idols. He directly challenges the Wanderer, mocking his stone resolve as nothing more than papier-mâché. And that mocking laughter, it's the ultimate insult, and it literally shatters the Wanderer's intellectual armor.
Because, well, underneath all that terrifying, diamond-hard intellectual armor, there's really just a fragile, terrified little king desperate for a round of applause. It's a grand, tragic comedy. A tiny man piloting a giant suit of logical armor suddenly exposed for the world to see. With a sharp tap from the Wit, the whole facade collapses into a heap of delightful absurdity. The big takeaway from this first parable is that no absolute truth, when held too tightly by the ego, can ever survive the chaotic medicine of the spill.
Which brings us to part 2, the Banquet of Liquid Logic.
With his paper fortress completely gone, the Wanderer tries a new strategy. He descends into this dark, conceptual space to weave a tapestry of order to govern the stars. He finds himself in the infinite dungeon of high time. This is a hyper-rational void, and it represents the ultimate trap for the last man. He's trying to map and conquer his isolation entirely through precise equations. He's frantically drawing them on the frozen floor, stubbornly convinced that if he maps the void, he conquers it. He's completely ignoring the shadow whispering that he is literally just building a prison out of his own mind.
So he draws the equations. But then, this beast called the Hunger emerges from the soot. And it doesn't fight the equations, actually. It simply inhales the blueprints. The rigid walls liquefy into this wet, black slurry. The tragedy of forced order becomes a completely messy, unscripted improvisation. The Wanderer's desperate attempt at absolute control literally melts and drips away right around him.
I absolutely love this quote from The Hunger. I find your expectations quite nutritious.
This beast just casually devours all the rigid definitions of debt, justice, and order. It leaves the so-called master of logic standing in a literal puddle of wet sludge, totally lost in a cacophony of, wait, how did this happen? It's so deeply absurd. It proves that the void cannot be mapped. It can only consume the arrogant expectations of anyone who tries to cage it.
All right, part 3, the breeze of the artful mistake.
Here, the storyteller introduces a great merchant presenting a gray blueprint of execution to a terrified crowd. He's trying to seal their fate with a terminal, unbending script. The world under this calcified order has grown unbelievably stiff. People are walking around with the rigid gait of the last man, clutching waxless lanterns against the long tiredness. They are groveling in terror, absolutely petrified that even a single unscripted variable might rupture their miserable day-to-day existence. I mean, think about that. How often do we cling to a miserable routine just because we're terrified of a single unscripted variable? It's the picture of a society dying from a lack of spontaneity.
But into this stiffness steps the small. This is a jester figure, and she acts as a profound symbol of pure spontaneity. The jester represents the vital, unpredictable spark of life that breaks up dead logic. She whispers, "I am the breeze that reminds a stiff world how to dance, and I call your error art." With just a gentle, chaotic nudge, she literally trips the actors out of their calcified posture. Instead of bringing destruction, this chaotic intervention reminds a totally stiff world how to breathe again, and more importantly, how to dance.
It takes just a single, well-timed hiccup, a spilled cup of tea. The ink on the fatal, rigid decree of doom is suddenly smudged, and reality completely rewrites itself into a decree of desert, a pure moment of spontaneous joy. This artful mistake is actually an essential pressure valve. Without it, reality would literally snap under the impossible tension of a hyper-rationalized, rigidly controlled world.
Finally, part 4, the wand and the wet ink.
Stripped of his blueprints, his iron hammer, and all of his absolute certainty, the wanderer stands in the ruins to finally face the throne of cold soot. He looks at the architect of ash, the very perspective narrating this whole tale for us. The wanderer realizes that the architect only sat on this decaying throne because the world had simply forgotten how to yearn for anything else. The choice is stark: stay in the cold soot of a justified termination, or embrace the fluid grace of the living song, stepping into the unknown with the courage to create. This is the philosophical climax of the whole fable.
Then the harsh, heavy strike of iron against stone surrenders. Picture the atmospheric shift here. Under the sudden, chaotic heat of this medicine, the heavy iron hammer of genealogy actually sweats. It softens. It melts down, transforming right there into the smooth, wooden grip of a jester's wand. And that oppressive shadow that followed the wanderer, it flattens out, unrolling into a lush velvet floor for a brand new play.
The wanderer fully embraces this. He cries out, "The stars only sing for those who dare to go under." His voice is no longer the dry, echoing rattle of a dying logician. It's become a living, vibrating song of the spill. By daring to abandon absolute certainty, he proves that his tragedy and the whole decaying setting of those cathedrals was really just a prologue to a beautiful, unscripted comedy.
The page remains damp. The ink of life is still vibrantly wet. As we see in this fable, abandoning the illusion of absolute certainty isn't a defeat at all. It's the ultimate catalyst for personal growth. By finally dropping the heavy iron of logic, the unscripted soul finds the courage to wield the wooden wand of creative freedom, ready to write the next messy, beautiful line upon the altar of creation.
Which brings us to the end of our explainer today. I want to leave you with this final provocative thought straight from the voice of the void itself. When your own cathedral of cardboard begins to fall, which master will you serve? Will you choose the cold ash of a scripted, justified termination, or will you embrace the artful mistakes and pick up the wet ink of the jester's wand? Something to think about.